This series is tied at 2. And it returns to Phoenix for a pivotal Game 5 on Wednesday night. And right here on TNT. Let's go to Craig with Steve Nash.
Well, Steve, this is a late game, particularly on the East Coast. It seems that San Antonio was dominating it. People that went to bed early are going to pick up the paper or something and say Phoenix won. They're going to say, how did that happen? How would you answer that?
I think simply we stuck with it. We could have folded a lot of times. They were playing great, making a lot of shots. Could have discouraged us, but it didn't.
In the late 2000s, the Spurs and Suns squared off in 4 playoff series over a 6-year period. The familiarity fueled the rivalry. A culture clash defined it. The establishment Spurs were building a dynasty, and the splashy Suns were revolutionizing offensive basketball. But the Southwestern antagonist history came to a head thanks to a play normally reserved for the ice, a hockey-style hip check against a Canadian, no less. That may have been the most influential moment of the 2007 playoffs.
And here is Nash being chased. And look out. As Horry sent Nash flying, and Bell goes at Horry. Nash got up. He wants to go at Horry. The Suns did not appreciate the foul by Robert Horry.
Do I remember it? I still have nightmares about it. We were going to win that game, go home, and have an opportunity to close out the series against the vaunted San Antonio Spurs.
I know for sure I would be 3 or 4 years younger looking. That's for sure. What else? They would. I probably wouldn't have the 3 ulcers I'd have. Only about 1. Those are physical stuff that definitely came out of that.
Well, I remember that it was talked about for a lot more than the seconds it lasted. When it is that Robert Horry, I think, accidentally ran into Steve Nash, and Steve found himself in soccer mode against the scorer's table.
I was trying to go there and take the charge, but I got there a little late, so I had to just, do a little body check.
Robert Horry has made a lot of big shots in his career. Some may say that was a cheap shot towards the end there when he forearmed you into the table.
Good one.
What is your impression of what happened?
Well, he just body checked me out of bounds. I understand he's frustrated. It happens. I'm sorry it happened to him, but, he did body check himself.
This was a classic what would have happened. I was calling the game with Steve Kerr, and we looked at each other when Robert Horry gave that hip check, or as Steve Nash referred to it as a body check.
Phoenix has it won. It's going to be 2-2. They've got home court advantage. And then Horry knocks down Nash, outruns Stoudemire. Diaw runs up the sidelines. It's like, oh, here we go again. So many playoff games that I remember have altered series based on guys running out onto the floor. And my initial thought was, this is not going to go well for Phoenix.
At the time, I was the senior vice president in charge of basketball operations for the NBA. And part of my duties was to enforce the rules of the game and also maintain decorum and discipline in the game. In 2007, we had an incident in the Western Conference semifinals between the San Antonio Spurs and the Phoenix Suns.
There's some question whether Amar'e Stoudemire had left the bench to go over to your aid. Some people said maybe he was going in to check in. Did you have any inclination, or did you see where Amar'e was?
I have no idea. I was seeing stars from the check.
I was going to check on Steve. I'm walking toward him to see if he's all right, because this crunch time in the game right now, and so I'm making sure he's good, because we need him to finish off. This is the playoffs. We got to have our 2-time MVP on the court.
If I remember correctly, Stoudemire ran out to pick up Nash. I don't think he went out and confronted Horry. And I remember Diaw running up the sideline. I don't know. He left the bench area, but he didn't run on the floor.
Question is, did anybody leave the bench off this melee?
Oh, you see Stoudemire coming into the play, and the coaches sending he and Boris Diaw back to that bench area. The question is, were they on the court or not? And you talk about a young mistake. If indeed Stoudemire was on the floor, which looks like the league will have to look at very closely, and that could cost Phoenix Amar'e Stoudemire in Game 5.
And Boris Diaw and Amar'e Stoudemire violated the rule that required that players during an altercation, which at that time was between Horry and Steve Nash, during an altercation, you could not leave the vicinity of your own bench. Boris Diaw and Amar'e Stoudemire did, which required an automatic 1-game suspension.
You know, and I understand that they had a rule, but in the spirit of everything, I just didn't think it was a good decision. I just thought that they were applying letter of the law.
You know, by the letter of the law, the NBA did the right thing. I remember years earlier, 97 probably, Miami and New York got into a brawl, and like 6 guys took one step onto the floor and went back, and they all got suspended. And I remember at the time thinking, that's insane. Like, let's have some common sense here. But David Stern was so adamant about getting this stuff cleaned up that he was going to suspend anybody.
I will say that the commissioner and I did have a heated exchange, probably louder at his end when we discussed that, and maybe the only time in my life there was a 6-month period there where we actually didn't speak. And for somebody who's your mentor, that's an uncomfortable position.
We didn't wrestle very much with the decision because that rule is a pretty bright line rule. If you leave the vicinity of the bench, it is an automatic 1-game suspension. But in suspending Boris Diaw and Amar'e Stoudemire, it left the Phoenix Suns without 2 of their key players going into Game 5. And it affected, in all likelihood, the outcome of Game 5, which the Phoenix Suns lost to the Spurs.
Steve Kerr mentioned when you guys are down 11, he goes, this could be a defining moment if they could get over this hump and being a championship team. Do you look at it that way?
Well, I think we got a long way to go. Maybe after all said and done, we can look back at this, but I think there's so many moments left to go, let alone in Game 5 and the rest of the series, and then the playoffs beyond if we're lucky enough to get by them. So we got a long ways to go.
The Suns wouldn't get by the Spurs, losing Game 5 at home and then dropping Game 6 in San Antonio. But what if Horry hadn't sent the 2-time MVP sailing and set off the scuffle that led to the suspensions? What if Phoenix had been at full strength for Game 5?
Would they have won? I mean, there's no way that I would sit here on camera and tell you that that Suns team was a better team than what we had that year, especially going on and winning the championship. But there were tremendous matchups and some of the most elite play by pick-and-roll players that I had seen since Stockton and Malone.
Who can tell? You know, Amar'e is a streaky player. You know, Diaw is a streaky player also, so you can't say. You know, he might have made Tim mad, not having me on the court with him. He might have went with a triple-double. I just think sometimes the basketball god shines down on the teams they want to shine on.
We had the advantages, man. I mean, we had a young team, athletic team, and we had the experience of already being there a few times playing against the Spurs. And we felt like we was on the verge of winning that series. So I do think that wouldn't have played out that way, we probably would have won the series.
I felt they would have, only because if you go back to that time, the Phoenix Suns were probably playing the best basketball in the NBA at that time. They were coming off a 61-game season. It was an all-star season for both Nash and Stoudemire.
You know, as a player on that team, I like to think that our chances were still good, even if those guys had played in Game 5. I know that was a home game, but the Suns had their chance and did not even push that series to a Game 7. So as controversial as that series was, I like to feel like the better team ended up winning. And I know we went 8-1 after that and ended up winning the eventual championship for the 2007 season.
But did the hip check ultimately cost the Suns a shot at their first NBA title? What if they'd beaten San Antonio?
Well, given the fact that the Spurs went on to win the championship and beat the Cavaliers 4-0, I would say yes. If the Phoenix Suns had reached the finals, they probably would have won an NBA championship.
I think that was probably Phoenix's best chance to win a title. They were right in their sweet spot. Nash was in his prime. Yeah, that's one that Suns fans will always look back on and shake their heads. But it was their best opportunity to knock off San Antonio.
It changed the complexion of the series, and I'm sure the Phoenix Suns to this day are thinking, what if perhaps if our guys were there, it would have been a completely different story. It was a perplexing situation, obviously, for the Phoenix Suns, and it's something I'm sure they have not forgotten to this day.
We would have won the championship. It would have been a game changer for the Phoenix Suns franchise, and who knows what would have happened at that point.
No, I don't know. You know, would we have won? The fifth game is, 80% of the time whoever wins the fifth game wins the series. Yeah. To go back home with the full roster, maybe. But we might have got beat anyway, so I don't know. I don't dwell on it that much, except when I see Robert Horry.